Talk Southeast Asia. You're here with Bridget Welsh. Thank you, listeners, for tuning into the podcast. This is episode 40 here in season 3. In the Philippines, we've seen considerable developments. We've seen the former President Duterte formally charged. The papers for the charges were in July, but they were revealed last week. They involve 3 charges of crimes against humanity, involving 76 deaths from 2011 to 2019. It remains unclear whether or not Duterte will be able to stand trial due to his health and capacity issues. But these issues continue to have deep polarizing effects in the Philippines and continue to raise the sincerity of those that were impacted by these horrible killings. The Philippines is focusing intensely on the flood control scandal that involves $10 billion and now encompasses over 50 different politicians. Let's remind us again for that number, 50 different politicians. It is a very serious scandal. This comes when the Philippines was hit by super typhoon Bulao, also known as Ragasa. It involved 400,000 people being evacuated from Visayas Islands, as well as multiple deaths, over 11 officially, but still more people missing. The Philippines have been impacted by multiple storms in politics and everyday life, that people are being impacted by disasters. This nexus between managing infrastructure, managing weather, use of political accountability continues to be an area needed for political reform the world over. No question that there are very serious issues involved. Southeast Asian leaders took to the global stage this week as well. Prabowo Subianto spoke about a 2-state solution at the UNGA meeting for Palestine. Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan from Singapore spoke about the need for the UN itself to reform, to change the veto, while Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim visited Timor-Leste after 23 years, signaling more inclusion in ASEAN. This week in Straight Talk, we speak with Natalie Sambi of Verve Research. She's the executive director there. She does a very fascinating deep dive with my co-host, Zachary Abuza, on the issues of military-civil relations. I also speak to Wasisto Harjo Jati about the cabinet reshuffle and contemporary dynamics in Indonesian politics. These 2 interviews complement each other, offering different perspectives about a changing Indonesia, the biggest country in Southeast Asia. This interview with Natalie and Zach marks an important point in this year's episodes at Straight Talk. Unfortunately, Zach has had to go on hiatus for professional reasons, will no longer be able to be a formal co-host of this program. I want to take a moment to thank Zach for his tremendous contributions this year, his insights, and I know the listeners and myself will feel the loss of not having him in the program. I will continue to do my best to bring these issues with the many guests that I have about what's happening in the region to all of you. Thanks as always for listening in.
Thank you so much for joining us. This is such an important topic, and you know better than anyone else how critically important it is to study civil-military relations in Southeast Asia. While there have been a lot of concerns about Prabowo Subianto, how did civil-military relations evolve under President Joko Widodo?
I think it's really important to start with Jokowi's predecessor, who himself was a retired general, but particularly reform-minded. So Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, who was president for 10 years, managed what we would consider to be traditional civil-military relations, where he kept the military primarily as a security force. He had 2 civilian defense ministers, and he focused largely on keeping the Tentara Nasional Indonesia, or the TNI, as an external security force and boosted its role in peacekeeping. So largely at that point, the military was out of politics. There were no more mandatory seats because we were in the reform era. Jokowi had none of those instincts. He didn't have the military background or the understanding of why militaries should be primarily an external security force. He was more of an opportunist, I would argue, and he used the military more as a political tool than SBY. I would point out a couple of trends we could see during the Jokowi era from 2014 to 2024. The first is an increase in active and retired military personnel around the president. We saw greater retired officers appointed as ministers. We saw military officers have roles retired around political parties, as key advisors to the presidents who were around in campaigns. We also saw this intergenerational connection from Jokowi's inner circle to key military appointments. So we might see, for instance, key advisors and then their son-in-laws being appointed the chief of army or the head of the presidential force. The second really key change under the Jokowi era was this formalization of military activity in the civilian sphere through MOUs with civilian agencies, so memorandum of understanding, where there would be a role created for the military, for instance, in the provision of assistance in agriculture. So there was an MOU signed with agriculture. There were also contracts signed with companies for the military to provide private security to mining companies, which provide important elements of the national economic activity. But still, there are questions about the appropriateness of army personnel as ad hoc security guards. Another important one to point out is at the beginning of Jokowi's presidency, he talked about perhaps having a reconciliation with victims of human rights violations. Part of that included a conversation about the events of 1965 to 1966. But what ended up happening around 2016, 2017 is that retired officers were given the latitude to define the national conversation about what happened in 1965. They were effectively allowed to mute any possibility of reconciliation with victims' families, those who were considered victims during the anti-communist purges. Last but not least, obviously there are others, but these are the main ones. Jokowi reinforced the territorial command system by increasing the wages for the village non-commissioned officers. Indonesia has a unique military structure where the military is present from the provincial levels, which is the next highest part of the state under the state itself, down to the village. So there is a military officer and then an NCO present at every level. So Jokowi reinforced that. Critically, one thing during the Jokowi era is you saw the first outright challenge of civilian authority since presidents were directly elected. A particular military chief I'm thinking of, General Gatot Nurmantio, who was the military commander Jokowi inherited, started to be much more of a political actor that challenged Jokowi's authority in a couple of areas. Jokowi was not happy with that. Obviously, Australia was one of the casualties of that. At one point, Gatot Nurmantio cut defence cooperation with Australia. But the impact of that was important, which was that after Gatot Nurmantio was removed, Jokowi set about installing only loyal military and police generals around him, which was known as the Gang of Solo. That reinforced this layer of loyalists. As we know, loyalists tend to follow the leader, not necessarily laws or the constitution, and I think this has set quite a dangerous precedent that we can see under the Prabowo administration today.
So now we have the inauguration of Prabowo Subianto, who has his own very checkered human rights record from his time in service. In March 2025, soon after his inauguration, Parliament passed a revised TNI law. What has changed? What prompted the rewrite? And what would you discuss as the immediate impact?
That was a really key early thing in the Prabowo presidency. We have to start with what was the point of the original law of 2004, and that was to really establish the military's role after the new order, where the military was used in multiple different ways other than security. The original law established a lot of the guidelines for what the military was supposed to do, the areas it could work in, sundry things like the age of retirement. The revisions that were passed, you mentioned in March, revised several of the articles. For instance, they expanded the military's role in military operations other than war. That included an expansion into the cyber domain and reinforced the idea that the military is responsible for the evacuation of Indonesian citizens during certain crises overseas. Article 53 raised the retirement age for non-commissioned officers and officers. There are other revisions made, but I think the one that caught public's attention and international attention was Article 47. Now, Article 47 in the original law articulated where active duty personnel could have jobs in civilian agencies. And what the revised law did was to expand that included a couple of other agencies on top of state intelligence and the search and rescue agency on narcotics. It increased that to include cyber and cryptography, disaster management, counterterrorism, maritime security, and the Attorney General's office. What happened then is there were massive protests about not only the passage of this law, but the way in which this law was debated. What that tells us is that within Indonesia itself, there is still a conversation that needs to be had about if the military is going to be moved into civilian agencies, how people feel about that. Are there sufficient guardrails in place that these roles will be curtailed? What does it mean for civilian public servants if you're having an influx of military officers into these agencies? What will the quality of oversight mean? So there were lots of really important questions. During these protests, a lot of these groups talked about the erosion of civilian supremacy. I think that's an important point, but there also needs to be a larger conversation about, is there effective or high quality civilian supremacy in Indonesia? It's one thing for the government to say, oh, look, we're civilians, we can manage this increased role of the TNI into civilian agencies. But do we really see robust institutions of democratic control over the armed forces? Things such as the courts, the Corruption Eradication Commission, a healthy police force, and a vibrant and free media as well. There were lots of questions about not just the law itself, but the way in which it was debated. One of the things that it was done is that it was being discussed during Ramadan, which also angered a lot of people as well. In practical terms, there were some important revisions made, but still questions about what does this really mean for civil-military relations? And the protests from students, human rights groups, and even in the media tells us that question is not quite settled satisfactorily.
For those who are on the outside watching us, and are they correct or is it fair when they describe what's happening as this neo-dual function of the military?
If we take some of those really banal revisions made to the law, I should point out that as Indonesians are living longer, things like a revision of the retirement age of military officers is necessary, and redefining the military's role to include things like hybrid threats, like the cybersecurity threats, is really important as well. But that Article 47, it really triggered a collective trauma to the Suharto era, where the military, as you said, had this dual function, dui fungsi or dual function, where it was legally mandated to have not only a security role, but a pervasive role in politics, society, economics, diplomacy, intelligence, and even the media. What that looked like during that era were mandatory seats in parliament, a pervasive control over the intelligence apparatus, heavy sense of media controls as well. Are we seeing the same thing? Are we seeing that legalization of the military's role in politics? Not necessarily, but if we look at the spirit of Dui Fungsi, the spirit of Dui Fungsi is about a security role and a non-security role. What you're saying are concerns about perhaps encroachment into other areas. Let's look at that systematically. Political influence. Okay, not mandatory seats in parliament, but we do have increasing presence of active duty and retired personnel in political circles. Even in June this year, we saw a small but retired group of generals file a petition to initiate impeachment proceedings against the Vice President, Gibran Rakabuming Raka. Maybe not formalized influence, but increasing influence, bureaucratic influence. With the Article 47 revisions, we now see an expansion of military presence in civilian agencies, which has potentially an impact on the culture within bureaucracies. Will civilian public servants feel like they have the ability to question certain kinds of policies with a military manager? Will there be sufficient controls and civilian oversight over the defense budget, for instance? What is the importance of a civilian in those contexts? It's that they are the repository and the guardians of bureaucratic processes which provide stopgaps and provide controls on these processes, and they're the experts on these things. Economic influence. We've seen training courses provided for military officers to be involved but not own state-owned enterprises, so not quite like it was under the New Order, but being involved in things like managing food security and food estates, which includes complex decision-making. When we also then look at the social aspect, which has been a large part of the Indonesian military, this social role, because part of its identity is this idea of the People's Army. We have had these systems called TNI Social Service or TNI Integrated Village Development. Those things have been going on for a long time, but they have been expanded in recent years. When we look at the balance sheet and we say, okay, strictly we don't have the Dui Fungsi, which was legalized like it was under the new order. When we look in substance, there are some areas of growth there that we should ask ourselves, does this resemble a pervasive security, non-security role? There's no judgment on that right now. There might be certain areas where the military is used as a stopgap. But the question is the long-term use of the armed forces in non-security roles for the betterment not only of society and politics, but for the military itself as well? I posted a photo of a book about Dui Fungsi Abri, and I had said the quote, to Dui or not to Dui? That is the question. A colleague of mine responded, why Dui when you can multi? Because it seems to him in particular, the TNI is not just dual function, but multifunction.
We've seen the nationwide unrest emerge in the past few months for multiple reasons. It's not just the response to the changes in the TNI law. There are a host of economic challenges facing the administration. But Prabowo has been very harsh in his condemnation of the demonstrators. Maybe we should not be surprised by that. How has he and his new coordinating minister for politics and security used the violence to expand the military's role?
I think it's really interesting when you look at figures like Prabowo and Shafri Shamsuddin, who come from a military academy class of the early 70s, so their formative experiences are during the New Order. When the military was paramount, people didn't question military authority to think about what the formative and foundational experiences of these men have been, what their worldviews are. One really important part of that is language, and the role that their language functioned during these protests is a form of signaling. For instance, the use of words like chaos, treason, anarchists, oknum, which I think some of your listeners might know, this idea of rogue actors, Prabowo ordering the security forces to take, quote, firm action or to give them, quote, a blank check to restore order. Those are words that embolden and perhaps tell a signal to society, we will crack down. We will, if needed, use the armed forces in this way. Shafri Shamsuddin is the defense minister, but after a cabinet meeting on August 31st, he gave a press conference about the situation. Now, normally, that role would be given to the coordinating minister of political and security affairs, who at the time was Budi Gunawan, who was primarily responsible for domestic security. He wasn't there, and that was, to a lot of Indonesian security analysts, unusual. That didn't signal a very positive sign for confidence in someone like Budi Gunawan, who was also a former police general. The one thing that these protests also pushed on was rivalry between the military and police. A lot of people's discontent was about the heavy-handed nature of the police treatment, the arrest of people without much knowledge about where they had been taken for questioning. A couple of days after the protest, the army was deployed to the streets and helped in the cleanup, and there was big social media campaigns about look how good the army are and look at the horrible police. And so there was an opportunity there for the army to position itself favorably. Interestingly, it could have even been an opportunity for Prabowo to sack the police chief Sigit Listio, who has become the target of a lot of ire and discontent of the public. I would say that because Sigit Listio is also an ally of President Jokowi, so if Prabowo wanted to take the opportunity to really clear the decks of anyone who weren't one of his boys, he could have done it. Whatever the case, the army was deployed to the streets, but it still managed to hold on to a positive image there for now. I think this is interesting to see how the military might be used in future. There was concern amongst the Jakarta Post editorial team that there would be, for instance, the invocation of martial law. This, many op-eds at the editorial board of the Jakarta Post penned, brought up the spectre, this collective trauma of the new order. There is concern that the president and his inner circle might revert to things that they're comfortable with and might revert to these kinds of instincts of using security forces in this way.
Prabowo's inner circle is really quite small, and they just have this shared worldview from a shared experience in Timor and Papuas. The more we see the military be called into food security or vaccine production, or even dealing with quelling civil unrest or domestic bureaucratic administration, that's time, resources, and energy that the military is not focused on modernization and professionalization. Maybe you could talk about, since the fall of Suharto, what we've seen in terms of military professionalism and modernization, and where you think that could go under Prabowo.
I think you hit the nail on the head, Zach. When I used to be at ASPE, our head defense economist used to say to me, you can only spend every dollar once. And I think you're right. Same goes for time in the armed forces. If the military is not focused on their core mission, then they are going to be spread incredibly thin. What's the main mission of the Indonesian military? It's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And one could argue that some of that comes from the internal side, but when we look at the horizon of security threats against Indonesia and the Indonesian state, they also include areas of maritime security. That's probably one of the most critical, looking at the archipelago. We're not even just talking about illegal fishing, which costs the country an approximately $3 billion a year. We're looking at the potential of armed conflict in the Indo-Pacific that would involve the passage of commercial ships and military assets through the Indonesian-Malaysian archipelago. What capacity does the Indonesian Navy have under such circumstances? Because the modernization project since the Suharto era had aimed for around 274 vessels, and we know that modernization project is only around 60-70% complete. There are bigger questions there about how much budget is available to modernize the Indonesian military fleet. Does the Indonesian Navy have sufficient personnel? Do they have enough maritime installations, even though there has been increased build-up of maritime installations around the Natuna Islands, for instance? But this is an ongoing project, and that will need resources. If under the Jokowi and the Prabowo administrations, a lot of that is being then directed towards land forces, that there are questions there about whether that's a sustainable long-term trend. When we look at professionalism, we talk about professionalism that includes respect for the Constitution and for law, for human rights. The military of today has come a long way from the military of the New Order, for sure. And that's not to say that there haven't been issues and challenges with human rights allegations as well. But certainly what you said earlier, a military that is being deployed as riot police or internal security actors to provide specialization in agriculture, for instance. I was reading the other day, they are now helping to train farmers in terms of crop diversification. That's not expertise that the military necessarily has time to develop, even if it is effective in the short term. There are still other skills that the military needs to do. And I think we need to highlight here that part of the driver for this has been the President Prabowo's idea of quick wins. Very open about that in the beginning of his presidency, that he wanted quick wins on the board. Leaning back on a familiar actor like the military, a trusted institution with a big logistics capacity, as you mentioned earlier, military research labs are now being tasked to providing cheap pharmaceuticals. That's time and resources away from other things. Again, we're coming back to the issue of oversight. The more in which you start to put military officers in civilian agencies, in particular the Ministry of Defense, it raises really important questions about oversight with respect to budget and processes as well. I think a professional military is really not just the product of its own training processes and assignment of tasks. It's also the product of a really strong civilian sphere, one that's transparent, one that's accountable and law-abiding. And if we don't find that really strong civilian sphere, whether in the bureaucracy or in political circles in the country, then the military will be challenged in that regard as well.
I think that's a perfect place to end this conversation. Thank you so much for your thoughts. I can't think of anyone who has studied civil-military relations as thoroughly as you have over the years, and you bring a wealth of information and speak with such clarity for our listeners. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Zach. My pleasure.
Hope you're enjoying listening to this episode. If you want to find out more about previous episodes, you can reach this on the website, straighttalksoutheastasia.com. The link should also be available in the show notes. If you want to contribute to the production costs of the podcast, you can hit the link, Buy Me a Coffee. Every little penny counts. All that money will not go to me, but go to the producers who are helping me to put the show together. Thanks for listening. We're talking about the political aftermath of the protests in Southeast Asia. We're starting here in Indonesia. And I'm really delighted to have Wasisto Raharjo Jati. He is a researcher at BRIN in Indonesia. He's in the Research Center for Politics. He is a very young, dynamic scholar watching what's happening in his country. Wasis, thank you so much for coming here on Straight Talk.
Thank you for having me, Bridget.
We've seen in the past few weeks an extensive series of cabinet reshuffles in Indonesia, and these come after the political protests. Can you lay out for our listeners what's happened, the drivers of these changes, and what do you see as the political implications?
I think the protest and the reshuffle is incidentally happened in the last 2 weeks. But the protest is a sign that publics already feel disillusionment with the current government. Since Prabowo taking the office in October 2024 until right now, many policies, many programs that might not meet the public expectation. For example, the mass layoff, many informal worker being sacked because the economic inefficiency, and then many young fresh graduate was in a long queue to get a job. All the things make up the huge protest in the recent times. At the same time, Prabowo also have huge ministers that comprise of many agencies. The comment is the problem because many minister, many agencies, but they have public communication skill to explain public how to being empathetic, how being sympathetic with public. So that's why this also make up friction in the internal Prabowo administration. So that's why taking the internal and external factor into account, that makes Prabowo did reshuffle for the second and the third time in this early September, because he want to make sure that the political stability, economic development should be not being disrupted by the protests.
Do you think the protesters are satisfied that he's making some shifts? What about these new people here? You hear a lot of different perspectives about Prabowo's new appointees.
The new Prabowo appointee in some aspect did not meet the public expectation. For example, for some ministerial position, it might just fulfill the elite demands rather than public interest. The current reshuffle that appoint some new figure, Minister of Finance, and then Minister of Youth and Sport, and then Minister of Hajj and Umrah, those new appointee only reflect Prabowo's ambition rather than public aspiration. So that's why in some aspect, public aspiration doesn't really present in the new composition.
I think the gap is something that is also creating a lot of uncertainty for the government. This past week, the military took out an advertisement in the newspaper. One of the issues about Prabowo's cabinet reshuffle has been the appointment of military allies for Prabowo. Now we see very challenging questions being raised about the militarization of Indonesia, the bringing back of the new order. What's your assessment? It's hard to imagine that a few years ago, the military would feel a need to bring out an advertisement on these types of issues and to justify their increased role in government.
In general, Prabowo adopts military governance in his administration, trusting civilians to take some strategic position. He must rely on the servicemen, especially the retiree, to take up some position. It is also Prabowo personal preference that give much trust to the military rather than the civilian, because the matter of royalty, the matter of hierarchy, and also of the command structure that might be efficient rather than employing civilians. So that's why Prabowo trusts some his flagship policies For example, food estate and then the current free nutritious meal. Some excellent position also being trusted to the military officer. For example, one of the director general under Ministry of Finance is also recruiting the active military personnel. Prabowo want to ensure that military should be involved in his administration. He believes that employing military is the key to secure his legacies. If he trusts the civilians, especially from politicians or from technocrats, just the second line on his flagship policies implementation. So that's the matters that we have today.
A lot more military in government in Indonesia, and we saw how that worked before. Let's see how it works now. Just one last question, Wasis. What do you think about how Gen Z's involvement in politics in Indonesia? Their voices are definitely increasing, but the sense of being able to influence the elite alliances and change the type of people who are governing, do you think that they're having an impact? And how do you see it evolving in the future?
The current voter generation is relying on the Gen Z and also the millennials. But we also have representation problem in this country. The elected Gen Z and its voters, there is also huge gap. Those elected lawmaker from Gen Z is part of the dynasty. He or she doesn't represent their Gen Z fellows. For example, in internal party faction in the national DPR, they just serve their party interest rather than their fellow Gen Z. So this make the problem in the Indonesia. In quantity, Gen Z make up almost 50% of the voter presented, but the number of elected Gen Z just very small. According to the latest statistic, maybe under 50%, if I'm not mistaken. So that's why the elected Gen Z is just symbolic representation in Indonesia. In reality, Indonesia facing many problems, as I mentioned earlier, the life prospect and then education problems. In early 2025, there was viral hashtag that went virally in social media, namely Kabur Aja Dulu, that reflects how Gen Z feel frustrated with in this country because they don't see the future in Indonesia. Most importantly, the lawmaker doesn't accommodate their aspiration. This unequal representation, the unequal line between voters and the elected lawmaker make up the Gen Z right now. Maybe in the next 5 year, 2029 will be abstain in the election. The protests will be erupted again if the elites unable to accommodate genuine aspiration from the Gen Z especially. Right now, the solution that being offered by the official might just partial to meet the public aspiration. For example, how to fix the current problematic premium nutritious meal and also how to get job sector being friendly in this country.
I'm sure, Wasis, we're going to continue to have these conversations about what's going on in Indonesia. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. This is Wasisto Rahangis Jati.